All right, welcome back everyone. In this video, I wanted to wrap up our treatment of bar charts, bar plots with ggplot2. So if you are just getting started with this video and you're curious, you're comfortable creating bar plots in ggplot2, and you're just wondering, how do I change the plot, which is showing counts on the vertical axis, to showing proportions on the vertical axis? So how do I convert frequencies to relative frequencies on the vertical axis? We've run some code before, and if you want the code that's going to follow to work, then you're just going to want to go over to runtime and click run before. This will run all of the previous code cells. It'll install the ggplot2 package into this notebook. It will install and then load the Palmer Penguins package into this notebook, and then you'll be good to go. And there's a link to this notebook in the description of this video. And so the idea here is, let's say we've got a plot like this one over here. And so if you've got everything installed correctly, you should be able to run a code cell that looks like this. And notice here's a bar plot where we're looking at penguins, and we're looking at the distribution of the species of penguins in this penguins data frame. So we can see there's like 150 of one species. We've got, I don't know, somewhere like about 60 of the chinstrap species. And there's, about 125 of this species over here. So on the vertical axis, we're displaying counts. Oftentimes, when you're looking at a bar plot, you might want to display a proportion. So in other words, out of all of the observations in the data set, what proportion of the penguins were of this species? What proportion out of all of the penguins were the chinstrap? What proportion out of all of the species were the gentoo, if I'm pronouncing that correctly? So how do we convert our bar plot from displaying counts on the vertical axis to instead displaying a proportion? And so that's what we're calling relative frequencies. And so if you go into the help documentation for these different geomes, so if you run !geom bar, you can see that one thing that's particular about each of these. So for geom bar, there's nothing that's mapped on the y-axis. So we haven't mapped any variable to the y-axis, and instead count is being displayed on the y-axis. And count is a statistic. So on the y-axis, there's no aesthetic, there's no variable which is being displayed on the y-axis. Instead, we are calculating a new value, the count, and ggplot is using some statistic that it's calculating from the data frame and displaying that statistic on the plot. And so we can see that from the documentation, the help documentation. It's telling us that somewhere in here, it should be telling us that, over here. So it's saying that it's using stat count by default. So it is telling us that the count is being used for each X position. Okay, so that is the default that's being displayed on the vertical axis. And if we look through here, that's what it's telling us about stat count. So I'm going to close this help documentation down so we can see this. So we can change the statistic on the y-axis if we want to some other statistic. And in this case, rather than use the count, what I would like to use is the proportion. And the way that I can change from the default, which is the count, to the proportion is mapping that to the y-axis. So I'm going to set the y-axis to the proportion in the following way. So I'm going to use the command after stat equals, and then in parentheses, prop for proportion. So this is going to map something other than the count to the y-axis. This is now going to map proportions to the y-axis. And I'm also going to define one more aesthetic inside here, which is the group. I'm going to set the group to 1. And now I'm going to choose my fill color to steel blue, but that's just a cosmetic thing. And now we can see the plot looks almost exactly the same as the previous plots. I mean, here the color is steel blue, it's the same, but the heights of the bars look the same relative to each other as in the previous plots, but the units have changed. So we're no longer displaying counts, or it's not like 150. What I can see now is that, like, out of all of the penguins in the data frame, overall about 40, I don't know, like 42% of them are from this first species, about 20% of them are from this second species, and somewhere about 35% of them are from this last species. So instead of telling me how many, I'm getting information about what percentage fall in each of these species. And if I add up all of those percentages, those should add up to 100%. So again, there were two changes that I needed to make to the aesthetic. I needed to add a Y aesthetic, and I changed that from the default, which was count. I now specify that I want after stat to be a proportion, and I also needed to set the group to 1. And so question 4 here is asking us, well, what would happen? Well, if we didn't set the group to 1, what would happen? So let me just take out that option. So if I just change the Y aesthetic to proportion after stat prop and didn't set the group, then what that does is it just, by default, it's going to set the height of each of those bars to the same height. And I actually get all of those bars have a height of 1. And so what I'm seeing here, it's like giving me like almost like a stacked bar chart. So it's saying out of all of the species, well, let me just say it's not giving me the bar chart that I want. That's the shorter story. So I need to include that group aesthetic in order to get a true relative frequency bar chart. If I don't include that group, I'm getting a bar chart that looks like this, which is not what I want. And we'll talk about that group aesthetic more in next week's module. For now, we'll mainly just focus on the more basic aesthetics in our plot. We've got enough to focus on in ggplot for now. But just know, if you want to create a relative frequency bar plot, you need to change the default from count to proportion by setting a Y aesthetic, and you might be caught off guard that you also need to change the group. And I don't think there's anything special about setting the group to 1. I think if I were to use group 2, it would give me the same exact plot. But you do need to define the group to a fixed value such as 1. If I don't do that, it's going to give me a bar plot that looks like this, which is not at all the accurate bar, which is not a relative frequency bar plot, because this is not telling me what proportion of the species are, what proportion of the observations are in each species. This would be misleading, and it looks like all of these species are 100%, which is not right. The total heights of all of these bars should add up to 100%. So this is clearly not an accurate bar plot for relative frequencies. Okay, and so just to wrap things up, at the very end of this section on bar plots is just some code. which creates what I'll call like a cleaned up bar plot that combines a lot of the different features that we've talked about. And a couple of things that we've added here. I've removed that gray panel in the background. If you don't like that, you can remove that by adding a black and white theme, which I've done over here. So that's the only additional change that we haven't talked about so far. Otherwise, we've discussed all of these other commands in previous videos. And here is a pretty sweet looking bar plot that displays the distribution of proportion of species in that penguin's data frame. Okay, thanks everybody. We will move on in the next videos talking about how we can create histograms in ggplot2.